The cold floor beneath Lieutenant Taewon Park's cheek was his first sensation as consciousness returned. His head throbbed with each heartbeat, a painful reminder of the ambush that had overwhelmed his scout ship at the edge of human territory. He groaned, pushing himself up to sitting position, eyes struggling to adjust to the dim purple lighting. "Where am I?" he whispered to himself, taking in his surroundings. The cell was massive, walls stretching upward at least 20 meters, made of some dark metal he couldn't identify. Everything about the space suggested it was designed for beings much larger than a human. Taewon checked himself for injuries. His uniform was torn and dirty, but his limbs seemed intact. His equipment was gone. No weapons, no comm device, not even his basic survival kit. Only his translator implant remained, a small comfort in this alien prison. A low rumble from the shadows made him freeze. He wasn't alone. Taewon squinted into the darkness at the far end of the enormous cell. 3 pairs of glowing eyes stared back at him, one amber, one emerald, one deep sapphire. As they moved closer, the sheer size of the creatures made his breath catch dragons. Not the mythical beasts of Earth legends, but Drakians, the feared warrior race from the galactic core. Each stood at least 7 meters tall, with armored scales that shimmered in the faint light. Their powerful wings were partially folded against their backs, and sharp claws clicked against the floor as they approached. The largest, with scales, the color of burnished copper and amber eyes, lowered its massive head to examine him. Taewon stood his ground despite every instinct screaming at him to run. "For you are smaller than the others they usually send," the dragon said, its voice surprisingly soft despite its size. The translator implant converted the series of growls and clicks into words Taewon could understand. "Others?" Taewon asked, finding his voice. "What others?" "Food," replied the smallest dragon, dark blue scales gleaming as it moved closer. "That's what you are to them. Entertainment for us, food for us." Taewon's mind raced. "Who's them? Where are we?" The copper dragon settled onto her haunches, regarding him with something like curiosity. "I am Nara. These are Day and June," she said, indicating the green and blue dragons respectively. "We are prisoners of the Collective, as are you now." The Collective? Taewon had heard rumors during his military briefings, an ancient multi-species empire that operated at the edges of known space. "They collect specimens," Nara explained, "from across the galaxy, study them, sometimes make them fight, sometimes—" She paused. "Make them eat each other." Taewon's stomach turned. "And that's why I'm here. To be your dinner." The green dragon, Day, snorted, sending a small puff of steam into the air. "That is what they expect. They have been giving us less food each cycle. They think hunger will drive us to primitive behavior." "They watch us," June added, blue scales rippling as he turned to look at a small blinking object in the corner of the ceiling. "Everything we do for their science, their entertainment." Taewon followed his gaze to what appeared to be some kind of monitoring device. He felt a surge of anger replacing his fear. "So that's it? I'm just thrown in here? To die for someone's amusement?" "Humans are classified as a weak prey species," Nara said matter-of-factly. "The Collective believes you have little value beyond your biological makeup. They will record how long you survive against us." Taewon stood straighter, squaring his shoulders. 5 years in Earth's Special Reconnaissance Division hadn't prepared him for alien dragons, but it had taught him never to show weakness in captivity. "Well, they've made a mistake," he said firmly. "I'm not prey." June bared his teeth, in what might have been a smile or a threat. "Brave words for a creature so small you would fit in one bite." Instead of backing away, Taewon took a step toward the blue dragon. "Size isn't everything. Besides, you don't look like you're in any hurry to eat me." "We are not mindless beasts," Nara said, sounding slightly offended. "Despite what the Collective believes." Taewon nodded slowly, mind already working on possibilities. "Then maybe we have something in common. They've underestimated both of us." He walked the perimeter of the cell, examining every surface, every joint, every potential weakness. The dragons watched him with increasing interest. "What are you doing?" Day finally asked. "Assessing our situation," Taewon replied without stopping. "I'm guessing you've tried breaking out?" Nara's tail twitched. "The walls are reinforced with materials even our claws cannot scratch. The door opens only from the outside. Taewon completed his circuit of the cell and returned to face the dragons. I'm Lieutenant Taewon Park, Earth Special Reconnaissance. I was on a mapping mission when my ship was attacked, and I don't plan on dying in this cell. The dragons exchanged looks, communicating silently in a way Taewon couldn't interpret. The small one has spirit, June said finally. Spirit does not break walls, Day countered. Nara studied Taewon thoughtfully. Perhaps there is more to humans than the collective knows. Tell us, small warrior, what would you propose? Before Taewon could answer, a harsh buzzing sound filled the cell. The dragons tensed, their muscles coiling beneath their scales. They're coming, Nara whispered urgently. The observation period is complete. Now they expect action. Taewon felt his heart rate spike, but kept his expression neutral. Then, let's give them a show they weren't expecting. The wall at the far end began to slide open, revealing a corridor beyond. Taewon had seconds to make a crucial decision, one that might determine whether he lived or died in this alien prison. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing not guards, but a narrow corridor. Taewon tensed, ready for an attack, but nothing came through. Food delivery, Nara explained, her copper scales catching the dim light as she moved toward the opening. Less than half of what we need. A small platform glided into the cell, bearing what looked like dried meat strips and strange purplish fruits. The dragons approached cautiously, their massive forms moving with surprising grace. Taewon stayed, back watching their behavior. The smallest amount of food was clearly meant for him, a tiny portion separated from the rest. A test, he realized. Would the dragons let him eat, or would hunger drive them to claim his share too? You should eat first, Taewon said, making a decision. All three dragons turned to stare at him. What? June asked, blue scales rippling with surprise. You're bigger. You need more food. Taewon crossed his arms. Besides, I want to prove something to our audience. He glanced meaningfully at the monitoring devices. Day snorted. The little human thinks he can outsmart the collective. Maybe I can, maybe we all can. Taewon approached the dragons slowly. They expect us to fight over scraps, to act like animals. That's what they're watching for. Nara's amber eyes narrowed, thoughtfully. And if we disappoint them, then we become a problem they didn't anticipate. Taewon smiled. Military strategy basics, be unpredictable. The dragons exchanged looks again, their silent communication impossible for Taewon to read. Finally, Nara nudged the human's portion toward him with one massive claw. Eat, small warrior. We are not yet desperate enough to steal from you. Taewon took the food but broke it in half, placing the larger portion back. Share it, as a gesture. June made a rumbling sound that might have been laughter. You would starve to make a point? I'd rather call it investing in allies. Taewon took a bite of the dried meat. It was tough and bitter, but he forced himself not to grimace. So, tell me about the collective. Know your enemy, right? Over. The meager meal, the dragons explained what they knew. The collective was an alliance of 12 species, all of whom considered themselves evolutionarily superior. They organized the galaxy into hierarchies based on biological traits they valued. Intelligence measured by their standards, physical adaptations, technological development. Dragons, Drakians, are classified as Category 3, Nara explained. Physically formidable, but lacking in what they consider proper civilization. And humans? Taewon asked. Category 6, Day said with a hint of satisfaction. Near the bottom, barely above non-sentient animals. Taewon didn't take offense. Because we're physically weaker. And your technology is primitive, June added. Your species has barely left its own solar system. But we've survived on Earth, which isn't exactly a gentle planet, Taewon pointed out. High gravity, extreme weather patterns, diverse predators. Nara tilted her massive head. Earth is considered a harsh world, yes, which makes your species' survival somewhat puzzling to the collective. It's partly why they collect humans. To understand how such physically unimpressive creatures persist, Taewon walked around the cell again, this time studying the dragons themselves, their armor-like scales, powerful limbs, the way their wings folded against their backs. Battle. Adaptations, all of them. Your planet must be harsh too, he observed. Volcanic. Unstable. High oxygen content makes fire a constant threat, Nara confirmed. We evolved to survive it. Taiwan nodded, pieces falling into place in his mind. So the collective puts species from similar environments together to see who's better adapted. That's this experiment. One of many they run, Day said bitterly. Our rebellion against their rule failed. Now we provide them with data. Taiwan stopped his pacing. Tell me more about your rebellion. The dragons described a coordinated uprising across several star systems, planned for years. It had failed because of poor communication and mistrust between species. The collective had exploited those divisions masterfully. You tried to fight with strength alone, Taiwan suggested. Brute force, June bared his teeth. We are warriors. It is our way. Sometimes the strongest attack isn't the most obvious one. Taiwan pressed his hand against the metal wall, feeling its seamless construction. These cells, they must have weaknesses, points where systems connect. We have searched, Nara said. Found nothing. You've been looking with dragon senses, Taiwan said. Let me try with human ones. For hours, Taiwan examined every centimeter of their prison, while the dragons watched with growing interest. He studied the ventilation system, the lighting panels, the way sound carried through different sections of the walls. The collective relies on technology that works against most species, Taiwan explained as he worked. But every system has exploitable flaws. In special reconnaissance, we're trained to find them. And have you, Nara asked, coming closer, found flaws? Taiwan tapped a section of wall near where the food had entered. The door mechanism has a different density. And listen. He knocked against it, producing a slightly different tone than the surrounding metal. There's something behind here. Control systems, maybe. Even if you're right, we cannot break through, Day said. We have tried. Maybe not with strength, Taiwan agreed. But there might be other ways. He continued his methodical examination, asking questions about the dragon's experiences. How often guards came? What patterns they'd noticed in the collective's behavior? What they knew about the facility's layout? As they talked, something unexpected happened. The dragons began to see value in his approach, offering observations they'd made but hadn't recognized as important. June remembered a slight temperature change near one wall during certain times. Day had noticed a pattern in the facility's ambient sounds, possible shift changes. You're different from the other humans they've sent, Nara said finally. Taiwan paused. How many others? 3, she replied quietly. They died quickly. They were afraid. Taiwan felt a chill. And did you? No, Nara said firmly. They starved themselves rather than approach us. The collective was disappointed. What made you different? Dai asked suddenly. Why aren't you cowering? Taiwan considered the question. On Earth, I was trained to survive capture, to resist interrogation, to find advantages in seemingly hopeless situations. He shrugged. And honestly, where I come from, we have stories about dragons. Powerful, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But also intelligent. Worthy of respect. June made a sound that was definitely laughter now. Your species tells stories about creatures you've never met. Humans imagine a lot of things, Taiwan said with a smile. Sometimes we're even right. As they continued talking, the atmosphere in the cell shifted. The dragons began sharing more. About their homeworld, their culture, the technology they'd developed before the collective conquered them. Taiwan told them about Earth, about human history, about the principles of guerrilla warfare, and asymmetric conflict. Your species fights even when outmatched? Nara seemed fascinated by this concept, especially when outmatched, Taiwan confirmed. We adapt, find creative solutions, use the enemy's strength against them. Like what you're doing now, Day observed, using their experiment against them. Taiwan nodded. They expect dragon and human nature to be predictable. Let's prove them wrong. The buzzing sound filled the cell again. This time, all 4 prisoners recognized it as a warning. Something was about to happen. They're impatient, Nara growled. No violence, no entertainment, Taewon felt a slight change in air pressure. I think they're about to raise the stakes. He moved closer to the dragons instinctively. Whatever happens next, remember, we need to work together. That's what they don't expect. The temperature in the cell began to drop dramatically. Frost patterns formed on the metal walls. The first test, June said, his massive body already beginning to slow. Cold makes us sluggish. Taewon nodded, mind racing through survival scenarios. Then I'll be your eyes and ears until it passes. Dragons and humans together. Let's show them what we can do. The three dragons gathered around him, their massive bodies forming a protective circle as the cell grew colder. Their scales began to dull as their metabolism slowed, but their eyes remained fixed on the small human in their midst, no longer seeing prey or food, but something they hadn't expected to find in this prison, an ally. The cold hit like a physical blow. Taewon's breath clouded in front of his face as the temperature plummeted. Frost patterns spread across the metal walls, like ghostly fingers reaching into their prison cell. Stay close, he told the dragons, his military training kicking in. Body heat conservation is critical. Nara's massive copper form was already moving sluggishly, her normally bright scales dulling as her metabolism slowed. This is how they break us, she managed, her voice thicker than usual. Dragons need heat. Taewon looked around the cell, mind racing. His human body was smaller, would lose heat faster than the dragon's massive forms, but he had one. Advantage. He was still moving normally while they were slowing down. I need materials, he said decisively. Anything that might insulate. The dragons watched with increasingly heavy-lidded eyes as Taewon stripped off his outer uniform jacket. He began tearing it into strips, working quickly despite his shivering fingers. Day, can you still produce fire? He asked the green dragon. Day opened his mouth weakly, producing only a small puff of steam. Not enough oxygen in this cold. Right. Taewon nodded, adjusting his plan. Then we conserve what heat we have. He approached Nara, who seemed worst affected by the cold. I need to check your scales, the areas where heat escapes fastest. The dragon nodded slowly, allowing the tiny human to examine her massive form. Taewon ran his hands along her neck ridges, feeling for temperature differences. Here, he said, finding spots where the scales overlapped less tightly. And here. He began packing the strips of his jacket into these gaps, creating makeshift insulation. What are you doing? June asked, blue scales now almost grey in the freezing cell. Trapping body heat, Taewon explained, working methodically. On Earth, we survive in environments from desert to Arctic. The principle is always the same: protect the core. He moved from dragon to dragon, finding their heat loss, points and improvising protection. His fingers were turning numb, but he kept working. They expect you to leave us, Day rumbled, watching the human with increasingly cloudy eyes. Save yourself. Taewon smiled grimly. That's exactly why I won't. As the dragons grew more lethargic, Taewon organized them into a tight circle, positioning himself in the middle. Wings, he instructed. Fold them around us all, create a smaller space to heat. With the last of their strength, the three dragons complied, their massive wings creating a tent-like structure. Inside this makeshift shelter, Taewon continued moving, keeping his blood flowing, sharing what little heat his human body generated. Talk to me, he urged them. Stay conscious. Why bother? June's voice was barely a whisper. Because we're going to survive this, Taewon said firmly, and then we're going to make them regret it. Hours passed in the freezing cell. Taewon kept the dragons engaged, asking about their homeworld, their customs, anything to keep their minds active as their bodies slowed. In turn, he told them about Earth, about deserts and mountains, oceans and forests. Humans adapt to all that? Nara asked through barely moving jaws. We're stubborn that way, Taewon replied, clapping his hands together for warmth. Not the strongest, not the fastest, but we endure. The cold grew more intense. Taewon's extremities lost feeling, but he forced himself to keep moving, checking on each dragon regularly. Their breathing had slowed dangerously, but they were still alive, still conscious. Listen, he said, positioning himself where all three could see him. When humans face extreme cold, We sometimes share a technique called the winter mind. It's about focusing inward, conserving mental energy, like we conserve physical heat. It was a technique from his survival training, a form of shallow meditation that helped maintain awareness while reducing the body's energy demands. Focus on your heartbeat, he instructed. Slow and steady. Imagine the warmth of your core spreading outward. The dragon's eyes remained fixed on him as he talked them through the technique. Whether it actually helped their alien physiology was unclear, but it gave them something to focus on besides the bone-deep cold. The collective doesn't understand, Nara said during a moment of slightly increased alertness. Understand what? Taewon asked, rubbing his arms vigorously. Cooperation, she replied. They see only predator and prey. A faint buzzing sound interrupted them. Different from the earlier warning, this was mechanical, purposeful. The cell door was opening. Taewon tensed. They're coming to check. Probably expect to find me dead, you three helpless. Jun's eyes narrowed to slits. What do we do? Despite his exhaustion and the cold, Taewon felt a surge of determination. We surprise them. He quickly explained his plan. The dragons would remain in their protective circle, appearing as incapacitated as they actually were. Taewon would position himself as if he'd collapsed near them, seemingly in a final, desperate attempt to steal their body heat. Then, when they enter, he whispered, we show them what cooperation really means. The door slid open. Two figures entered, tall, spindly beings with multifaceted eyes and exoskeleton-like coverings. They carried prod-like weapons and moved with the confidence of those who expected no resistance. Taewon lay motionless, eyes nearly closed, watching through his lashes. The guards approached, chittering to each other in a language his translator couldn't catch. One prodded at Nara's wing with its weapon. The dragon didn't react, playing her part perfectly. The guards relaxed visibly, moving closer to examine the apparently unconscious human. That was their mistake. With a speed that belied his frozen state, Taewon rolled and kicked upward, striking the nearest guard's joint-like knee. As it stumbled, Nara's wing swept forward with surprising force, knocking both guards off their feet. Dae and Jun, despite their sluggishness, managed to shift their massive bodies to block the exit. The guards scrambled backward, raising their weapons, but Taewon was already moving. He dodged the first electric pulse from their prods and closed the distance. Years of hand-to-hand combat training took over. He struck precise blows at what looked like vulnerable points on the insectoid guards, joints, eye clusters, what might have been breathing apparatus. One guard collapsed. The other fired its weapon wildly, missing Taewon but hitting Nara's flank. The electric shock seemed to jolt the copper dragon into greater awareness. With a roar that shook the frosted walls, she lunged forward, pinning the remaining guard. Beneath one massive claw. Should I end it? She growled, looking at Taewon. He shook his head, breathing hard. No, we need information. Using pieces torn from the guard's own equipment, Taewon bound them securely. The dragons watched with newfound respect as the human methodically searched the fallen enemies, examining their technology, testing the limits of their weapons. The temperature, Jun observed suddenly. It's rising. Taewon looked up, noticing the frost beginning to recede from the walls. They're adjusting the experiment. We've surprised them. Through the still open doorway they could see a corridor stretching into darkness. Freedom tempted, but Taewon hesitated. Not yet, he said, sensing the dragon's thoughts. This is just the first test. If we run now, we'll be captured again. Before we understand the layout, the weaknesses, Nara's amber eyes met his. You're suggesting we stay, voluntarily. I'm suggesting we learn, Taewon corrected, before we escape. Make them think they still control the experiment while we prepare. The dragons exchanged looks, then nodded slowly as warmth gradually returned to their massive bodies. The small warrior has wisdom, Dae rumbled. Taewon smiled grimly. The small warrior has experience. This isn't my first cage. He gestured to the bound guards. Now let's see what our friends here can tell us about what comes next. The guards revealed little before the collective retrieved them. Taewon had expected that. Interrogation was rarely so simple. But their mere presence in the cell had changed something fundamental. On the monitoring devices that watched their every move, the prisoners were no longer subjects behaving as expected. They had become a problem. "They'll escalate now," Tae-Won told the dragons as they huddled in the center of the cell, speaking quietly. "Physical discomfort didn't break us, so they'll try mental pressure." Nara's copper scales had regained their luster as her body temperature normalized. "What form will it take?" "If I had to guess." Tae-Won paused, considering his own experiences with captivity training. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, maybe hallucinations. As if triggered by his words, the lighting in the cell began to pulse. Bright flashes followed by near darkness, in an irregular pattern impossible to predict. "It begins," June growled, his blue scales reflecting the chaotic light. The flashing me continued for hours. Then came the sounds, high-pitched screeches that set Tae-Won's teeth on edge. The dragons suffered worse, their hearing more sensitive than human ears. Dai pressed his head against the floor, wings covering his ear openings. "Focus on your breathing," Tae-Won instructed, raising his voice over the noise. "Count each breath. Give your mind something concrete." The assault on their senses continued without pause. Day and night became meaningless concepts, marked only by the irregular delivery of diminishing food rations. The collective was trying to disorient them, break down their resistance through exhaustion and confusion. By the third day, or what Tae-Won estimated was the third day, the hallucinations began. It started with shadows moving where no movement should be. Then images projected on the walls, scenes of carnage from the dragon's failed rebellion, Earth cities in flames, distortions of reality designed to trigger fear and despair. Tae-Won found Nara staring at one wall, her amber eyes wide with distress. "What do you see?" he asked gently. "My clutchmates," she whispered, "dying in the mines after our capture. I couldn't save them." Tae-Won placed a hand on her foreleg. "It's not real, not here, not now. They're targeting your memories." Across the cell, Day was snarling at empty air, while June had curled into himself, wings wrapped tightly around his body. Tae-Won moved between them, grounding each dragon in turn. His human brain was affected too. He saw flashes of his ship breaking apart, imagined hearing his crew's screams, but his training gave him tools the dragons lacked. "Circle up," he ordered with quiet authority. "Face outward. Watch each other's backs." The dragons complied sluggishly, arranging themselves with Tae-Won at the center. "Now listen carefully. I'm going to teach you something humans use to resist psychological manipulation." He explained a simple technique, a form of mental compartmentalization used by soldiers in captivity situations, the ability to recognize outside influence and create a protected inner space where thoughts remained one's own. "Picture a fortress," he instructed. "Not a physical place, but a mental one. The walls are your boundaries between what's real and what they're trying to make you believe." The dragons struggled at first. Their minds worked differently than human ones. But gradually, Tae-Won adapted the technique to concepts they understood: territorial boundaries, nesting grounds, the mental disciplines of their own warrior traditions. Hours stretched into what felt like days. The psychological assault intensified. The projected images became more personal, more painful. Voices whispered from the walls, some in languages the dragons recognized, others that Tae-Won's translator picked up as fragments of military communications from his own ship. But within their circle, a strange calm began to develop. When one faltered, the others provided support. Tae-Won taught them to ground themselves through physical sensation, the feeling of scales against the floor, the sound of their own heartbeats, the rhythm of shared breathing. "Humans endure this?" Day asked during a brief lull in the sensory. "Barrage. We've done worse to each other," Tae-Won admitted grimly, "which means we've learned to survive it." As the psychological assault continued, Tae-Won noticed something unexpected. The projectors creating the hallucinations operated in patterns, sequences that repeated at intervals, and during those sequences, subtle changes occurred in the cell's systems. "There's a power fluctuation," he realized, watching a slight dimming in the base lighting. Every time the images cycled to a new sequence, his mind began working the problem. The collective's technology was advanced, but it operated on principles that could be understood. During his examinations of the cell, he'd identified what might be control nodes near the ventilation system. While the dragons maintained their protective circle, fighting their individual battles against the hallucinations, Tae-won studied the patterns more closely. He began timing the fluctuations, noting which projections required more energy, looking for weaknesses in the system. On what might have been the fifth day, as Nara coached June through a particularly vicious hallucination, Tae-won made his move. During a power fluctuation, he slipped to the ventilation panel he'd identified earlier and wedged his fingers into a nearly invisible seam. The metal gave slightly, not enough to escape, but enough to access the circuitry behind. Careful not to trigger any alarms, he explored the components with his fingers, mapping connections he couldn't see. "What are you doing?" Nara asked, her voice hoarse from the constant strain. "Fighting back," Tae-won replied without looking up. "Every system has vulnerabilities, even theirs." He worked methodically, using stray bits of metal he'd collected from their food deliveries to manipulate the circuitry. The dragons provided cover, positioning themselves to block the monitoring device's view of his activities. "Even if you disrupt it, they'll just repair it," Day pointed out. Tae-won nodded. "I'm not trying to break it. I'm trying to understand it." His fingers traced a particular connection, feeling the energy pulse through it, and maybe use it. As the hallucinations battered their senses, Tae-won continued his painstaking exploration of the cell's systems. Bit by bit, he built a mental map of the technology surrounding them, not just the psychological warfare tools, but the fundamental systems keeping them imprisoned. There's a pattern in the images, he realized suddenly. Not just technical, informational. The projections weren't random. They followed sequences, yes, but those sequences contained embedded data. Maintenance codes, perhaps, or system identifiers. Information the collective never intended their prisoners to notice, much less understand. Tae-won began to copy these patterns, memorizing sequences, correlating them with the power fluctuations and system responses. The dragons, seeing his intense focus, took on more of the burden of maintaining their collective mental defenses. On the seventh day, when the cell door slid open for another meager food delivery, Tae-won was ready. As the platform entered, he caught a glimpse of the corridor beyond, and more importantly, the control panel beside the door. That night, as the dragons huddled together against a particularly vicious round of sensory assault, Tae-won whispered, "Here's discoveries. The hallucination system is connected to the main environmental controls," he explained, "and they're using unencrypted maintenance codes in the projection patterns." "How does that help us?" June asked, his once bright blue scales now dull with exhaustion. "It means I can potentially override their systems," Tae-won said. "Not enough to escape, not yet, but enough to fight back." Using materials from their food trays and components he'd carefully extracted from the ventilation panel, Tae-won had constructed a crude device, little more than arranged metal bits that could channel and reflect the projection energies in specific patterns. "The next time they escalate," he explained, "we'll be ready." They didn't have to wait long. On what Tae-won estimated was the 8th day, the air in the cell began to change. A faint mist entered through the ventilation system, not quite visible but detectable as a metallic taste at the back of the throat. Gas. Nara recognized it first, her nostrils flaring. Mild toxin. Tae-won nodded. This is it. Their final test. He positioned himself near the ventilation panel, device in hand. "When I activate this, be ready. Things will happen quickly." The dragons took positions around the cell, their exhausted bodies tensed for action. Despite days of psychological torture, their eyes were clear, focused on the human who had somehow become their leader in this prison. "Whatever happens," Tae-won said, looking at each of them, "remember what we've learned. They expect us to break under pressure, to turn on each other when survival is threatened." Nara bared her teeth in what Tae-won now recognized as a smile. "Then we shall disappoint them one final time." As the gas grew thicker, Tae-won raised his makeshift device to the ventilation panel. In his mind, he ran through the sequences he'd memorized, the patterns hidden in the hallucinations that had tormented them for days. "Now," he whispered, "we show them what happens when you lock a human in with dragons." The gas thickened in the air, its metallic taste growing stronger. Tae-won held his breath as he positioned his makeshift device against the ventilation panel. His fingers moved with deliberate precision, aligning the crude arrangement of metal scraps to catch and reflect the energy patterns from the hallucination projectors. 3, 2, 1. He counted down silently, then activated the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the cell into complete darkness. The sudden silence was as shocking as the darkness. The constant screeching tones cut off mid-pitch. Did it work? Day's voice came from somewhere to Tae-won's right. "Wait for it," Tae-won whispered. A low hum began to build from the walls, followed by a grinding sound from the ventilation system. The flow of gas stopped abruptly, replaced by a rush of clean air that cleared the mist within seconds. Emergency lighting kicked in, dim red strips along the floor that cast eerie shadows across the dragon's massive forms. "I realigned their control frequencies," Tae-won explained quickly, retrieving his device and moving toward the section of wall he'd identified days ago as a potential weak point. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before their backup systems engage." The dragons needed no further instruction. They converged on the wall section, positions coordinated through days of planning. Nara placed her massive claws against the seam Tae-won indicated, while Day and June braced themselves to either side. "Now," Tae-won ordered. The 3 dragons pushed simultaneously, their combined strength focused on the single point he'd identified. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shriek of tearing metal, the wall began to give. Alarms blared throughout the facility, but Tae-won had expected that. The collective would be rushing to contain their suddenly problematic experiment. Time was now their enemy. "Harder," he urged, as the gap in the wall widened to reveal circuitry and structural supports. Just a little more. With a final surge of strength, Nara broke through the inner wall completely, exposing a narrow maintenance corridor beyond. Tae-won slipped through immediately, moving to the control panel he'd known would be there based on the patterns he'd decoded from the hallucination sequences. His fingers flew across the alien interface, applying the maintenance codes embedded in the projection patterns. Behind him, the dragons forced their massive bodies through the opening one at a time, scales scraping against torn metal, wings folded tightly against their backs. "Which way?" June asked, the last to squeeze through. Tae-won pointed down the dimly lit corridor. "The central control hub should be that way, based on the power distribution patterns." They moved quickly despite their exhaustion, the dragons adapting to the confined space by positioning themselves in single file. Tae-won led, applying what he'd learned about the facility's systems to bypass locked doors and avoid security checkpoints. At an intersection, they encountered their first resistance. 4 guards of the insectoid species they'd encountered before, armed with more substantial weapons than the prods from earlier. Tae-won didn't hesitate. "Pattern 3, he called, using the combat formations they'd practiced in whispers during the long days of psychological torture. The dragons responded instantly. Nara and Day moved to the sides while June dropped low, creating multiple targets. Before the guards could coordinate their fire, Tae-won sprinted forward, sliding beneath their aim and striking upward at vulnerabilities he'd identified during their previous encounter. One guard fell immediately. The others turned their weapons on the dragons, but the confined space worked against them. A blast that might have stopped Nara in the open merely scorched her armored scales in the narrow corridor. She responded with a sweep of her tail that sent 2 more guards crashing into the wall. The final guard fired wildly, catching Tae-won in the shoulder with a glancing shot. Pain blazed through his arm, but he pushed through it, rolling forward, to kick the guard's legs from under it. Day finished the encounter with a precise strike of his claws. "You're injured," Nara observed as they regrouped. Tae-won clutched his burned shoulder but kept moving. "It can wait. We need to reach the control hub before they lock down the entire facility." They encountered 2 more security teams as they progressed deeper into the facility. Each time, the combination of dragon strength and Taiwan's tactical guidance prevailed, though not without cost. Jones' wing was damaged by an energy blast, and Day took a serious hit to his flank that slowed his movements. Finally, they reached a sealed doorway, larger than the others. According to Taiwan's mental map of the facility, this should be the central control hub. "This is it," he said, examining the security panel, "but I can't override this one from outside. The codes I extracted don't have this level of clearance." Nara stepped forward, eyeing the door thoughtfully. "Then we make our own entrance." The three dragons positioned themselves side by side, gathering their remaining strength. At Taiwan's signal, they struck the door simultaneously, the impact reverberating through the corridor. Once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, the metal began to buckle. Inside the control hub, alarms screamed warnings. Voices shouted in panic. One final coordinated assault from the dragons tore the door from its frame, sending it crashing inward. Tae-1 rushed through the opening into a vast circular chamber filled with monitoring screens and control stations. The collective members inside scattered, varied species united by their shock at the prisoner's intrusion. Some were the insectoid guards they'd encountered. Others were tall, ethereal beings with translucent skin that pulsed with light patterns. Still others resembled something between plants and animals, with fibrous limbs and bulbous sensory organs. "Secure the central platform," Tae-1 directed, pointing to an elevated dais in the center of the room. The dragons moved with focused precision, forming a perimeter around the platform as Tae-1 leapt onto it. Before him spread an array of control interfaces, the heart of the facility's systems. A tall figure stepped forward from among the retreating collective members. Unlike the others, it held its ground, regarding Taiwan with what might have been curiosity. "Fascinating," it said, its voice translated through the facility's systems. "The human specimen demonstrates unexpected problem-solving abilities. The experiment yields valuable data." "This isn't an experiment anymore," Tae-1 replied coldly. "And we're not specimens." His hands moved across the control interfaces, applying the codes and patterns he'd memorized. Screen after screen responded to his touch, displaying facility schematics, security systems, communication networks. "You cannot hope to understand our technology," the collective member said, though a note of uncertainty had entered its voice. "Your species is classified as Category 6, barely sentient." Tae-1 didn't bother responding. He'd found what he was looking for, the facility's external communication array. With a series of commands, he bypassed the security protocols, opening a channel to the frequencies used by both human military vessels and, according to information he'd gleaned from the dragons, the Drakian resistance that had survived their failed rebellion. "This is Lieutenant Tae-1 Park of Earth Special Reconnaissance," he broadcast, his voice echoing through the control hub and out into space. "Broadcasting from Collective Specimen Facility 7 in the Cygnus sector. I am with Drakian Resistance. Members, requesting immediate extraction and military response." He appended the facility's coordinates, then turned to the still-stunned collective member. "Your classification system just failed." He gestured to the dragons standing guard around the platform. "We're not what you thought we were, any of us." More collective security forces were gathering at the entrances to the control hub, but they hesitated to enter, eyeing the dragons warily. Tae-1 used their hesitation to access more systems, disabling security throughout the facility and unlocking every containment cell. Across the monitoring screens, chaos erupted as prisoners of dozens of species found themselves suddenly free. Some fled immediately. Others turned on their captors. The carefully controlled experiment facility dissolved into mayhem. "You've doomed us all," the collective member said. "Some specimens are genuinely dangerous, uncontrollable. How you should have thought of that before you started collecting sentient beings," Tae-1 replied, continuing his work at the controls. "Every species has the right to freedom, to dignity." He found the environmental controls next, overriding the toxic atmosphere that had been pumped into their cell and instead directing it to sections of the facility where collective security forces were concentrated. Not enough to kill, but enough to incapacitate, buying time until help arrived. "The facility is compromised," announced an automated voice. "Emergency protocols engaged." Self-destruct sequence initiating, Tae-Won cursed under his breath. Of course they'd have a failsafe. He turned to the dragons. Change of plans, we need to find an escape vessel. According to the schematics now displayed on the screens, the facility maintained a docking bay with transport ships. If they could reach it before the self-destruct completed, this way, he called, jumping down from the platform. We have maybe 15 minutes. As they fought their way toward the docking bay, they gathered other freed prisoners, species. Tae-Won had never seen before, some terrified, others determined. A makeshift army of the formerly captive, united by the sudden opportunity for freedom. When they reached the bay, collective forces had established a defensive line, determined to prevent their prisoners from escaping. A firefight erupted, energy, weapons scorching the air. Cover me, Tae-Won told Nara, as they took shelter behind cargo containers. I need to reach that ship. He pointed to a transport vessel large enough to carry their growing band of escapees. What followed was the most intense combat of their escape. Day took a serious wound protecting a group of smaller prisoners. Jun used his damaged wing as a shield for Tae-Won as he sprinted across the open bay toward the transport. Inside the ship, Tae-Won found familiar control designs, similar enough to systems he'd studied that he could pilot it, if not expertly. As the freed prisoners poured into the transport, the self-destruct countdown entered its final phase. Everyone in, he shouted, powering up the engines. Now or never. The last aboard were the 3 dragons, backing into the cargo hold while maintaining covering fire against the diminishing collective forces. As the bay doors began to close, a final attempt to trap them, Tae-Won pushed the engines to maximum thrust. The transport shot forward, scraping through the narrowing gap into open space beyond. Behind them, the facility erupted in a series of explosions, the blast wave buffeting their escaping vessel, but not enough to damage it critically. They were free. In the cargo hold, surrounded by the diverse beings they'd helped liberate, Nara approached Tae-Won at the pilot's controls. You kept your promise, she said quietly. We survived, and made them regret it. Tae-Won smiled tiredly, setting course away from the expanding debris field. Humans are good at surviving impossible situations. Dragons, it seems, are too. On the communication array, signals were already appearing, responses to his broadcast from both human and Drakian vessels converging on their position. What happens now? Dai asked from where he lay, wounds being tended by some of the medical-capable former prisoners. Tae-Won looked out at the stars, then back at the improbable allies they'd gathered. Now we change the galaxy, together.